All right, we're live.
Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the House Cannabis Legalization Workgroup. This is a virtual workgroup meeting, so please be patient if we encounter any technical or streaming issues. And before I begin, I'll remind workgroup members that the briefing is being streamed on the Maryland General Assembly's YouTube channel. Workgroup members are going to be muted throughout the briefing. If you have a question after the presentation this evening, please use the raise your hand function within your Zoom window. Very briefly, I'm going to make a couple opening remarks, and then we're going to pass it over to Mr. Hudak to begin his presentation. But I think it's important as we effectively begin the second year of our work as the House work group that we kind of review where we've been. Last July, the Speaker established this work group with the intention that we would study, consider, and ultimately pass legislation in the 2022 legislative session to put the question of legalizing cannabis to voters. And during the 22 interim, this work group met several times and heard from a number of experts who spoke on a number of different issues and components related to legalization. As we approached the 22 session, and we took the information that we learned, and it was important then, we learned how important it was that we prioritize equity in our efforts and ensure that we were recognizing and addressing the impacts that the war on cannabis has inflicted, particularly on Brown and Black communities. We also needed to resolve issues related to expungement and incarceration and implement safe and reasonable public health parameters. So by the end of the 22 legislative session, the House of Delegates and the State Senate sent two pieces of legislation to address these aspects of cannabis legalization to the governor, where they went into law without his signature. The first was House Bill 1. It's our ballot question, and it's to the point. If voters approve the referendum in the general election, individuals who are at least 21 years old may use and possess cannabis on or after July 1st of 23. Upon approval of House Bill 1, significant portions of House Bill 837 will move forward and take effect. There's some parts of 837 that actually come into force a little bit prior to that, but the bill as a whole would take effect after July 1st. House Bill 837 is a comprehensive bill that reflects the findings of the work group and input from many key stakeholders and members of the General Assembly. It was the first of its kind to move from one chamber to another before passage back in the House in April. And House Bill 837, we set possession amounts and significantly lowered penalties on possession over that amount. Come the effective date, we required that simple possession charges for cannabis would be immediately expunged. And we required that anyone who's being held in a state or local prison or jail for simple possession would be resentenced and their incarceration ended. In House Bill 837, we set guidelines on civil use amounts, public consumption, the sharing of cannabis, and cannabis cultivation, allowing for any one household to grow up to 2 plants in a secure location. We also addressed the health components of cannabis legalization. We ensured that 2 studies will be conducted. One, to gather various cannabis-related statistics that include patterns of use, incidents of impaired driving, hospitalizations, calls to poison control, and use disorder. The second study, conducted by the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, will study home grow for patients to cultivate cannabis for personal use, the implementation of laws related to on-site consumption areas, and ways to ensure marijuana products do not appeal to minors. We also set guidelines tying cannabis use to the Clean Indoor Air Act. We also set up a cannabis public health fund and a public health advisory council in House Bill 837. And the fund, supported by the fund, the council will study and make recommendations regarding various cannabis-related issues, including youth impacts, addiction, misuse, advertising, labeling, and quality control. In order to continue our efforts to address the historic inequity that's been so pervasive in Black and Brown communities related to cannabis, and to ensure these communities have fair access to the industry, House Bill 837 also established necessary guidelines as we work towards finalizing the regulation and licensing components of this effort. And we will complete those components in the 2023 session. We also established the small minority-owned and women-owned Cannabis Assistance Fund, Cannabis Business, I should say, Assistance Fund, to assist these businesses as they enter the cannabis industry. The fund, which is effective on January 1st, 2023, will be available to support business operations and capital and will be targeted at those disproportionately impacted by laws against marijuana. We can't guarantee a perfect process. We have to be focused, thoughtful, and deliberate in our work, though, and we will work towards a perfect process. Therefore, House Bill 837 outlined the requirements for a disparity study to be conducted and finalized by November 1st of 2022. This study will be a roadmap to drafting legislation that includes an appropriate licensing structure and that ensures we have a diverse recreational cannabis industry. In the 11 months since the work group was established and since the Speaker announced her intentions to pass a referendum and companion legislation to legalize cannabis, we've delivered on the promises that she made with the passages of House Bills 1 and 837. And I'm proud of the work, effort, and cooperation that many people on this call were part of putting us in this position. But all of us recognize there's a lot more to be done, and that's why we've gathered here this evening. I understand that there is an election coming up. There are a couple elections coming up, but this work is important, and it's important work that we have to start right now. And so for this first meeting of the House Cannabis Legalization Work Group of the 2022 interim, we're joined by Dr. John Hudak. As you may recall, Dr. Hudak joined us for our first organizational meeting last summer, and I credit him with putting us all on a stable foundation when it came to the legalization efforts, successes, and failures that were occurring across the country. Today, Dr. Hudak is going to help us establish a similar footing regarding the regulatory and taxation and licensing structures related to cannabis that have been put in place by other states as we consider some of those same structures here in Maryland. Dr. Hudak, I'm going to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. But before we get started, I want to mention that Delegate Dumais is no longer a delegate. She is now, Her Honor, the Honorable Judge for the Circuit Court of Montgomery County. And we thank her for her work here and in the General Assembly on this issue for years and years in the past. She's been part of this process. But we wish her continued success and now welcome to replace her on the work group, Delegate Lily Chee, also from Montgomery County, who will be joining us shortly, and I look forward to her working forward. So we're going to hear first from Dr. Hudak tonight. We're going to have a discussion after Dr. Hudak about the next steps for the work group, and we'll take some questions and answers also for Dr. Hudak, who's going to make himself available. But for now, let's hear from him. Dr. Hudak is a Senior Fellow of Governance Studies and the Deputy Director at the Center for Effective Management at the Brookings Institution. And Dr. Hudak, if you are ready to go right ahead.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to read for about 12 to 15 minutes from prepared remarks and happy to entertain your questions after that. First, I'd like to thank the speaker for organizing this work group. Mr. Chairman, thank you for organizing today's session, and thank you to all the members of the work group for the opportunity once again to appear before you to testify and provide answers to your questions. I just want to note at the beginning that the views I express today are my own. They're based on my own research and do not reflect any institutional views of Brookings at all. At the request of the staff and leadership of the work group, I'm going to speak for about 3 specific topics related to cannabis legalization, taxation, regulation, and licensing. And while these are inherently interconnected issues, I'll speak about them today as separate verticals. But during the Q&A session, I'm happy to talk a bit about how they interlock. However, throughout my testimony, there will be a few common themes that the work group should take to heart. First, cannabis legalization and regulation is an exceptionally complex series of interrelated policy choices and should never be seen as a light switch that's simply flipped on. I know the members of this work group, several of whom I've previously testified before, know this, but it's important for your fellow members and for your constituents to understand this to be the case. Second, and in that theme, cannabis regulation is a process that takes time, careful consideration, significant cooperation and coordination, and perhaps most importantly, patience. Third, for each policy choice that the legislature and regulatory agencies settle on, there are trade-offs between competing views and available outcomes. Anyone who comes before this work group or the General Assembly and tells you that all of your goals are achievable and straightforward is selling snake oil. Often in the regulation of cannabis, there are competing outcomes and hard choices must be made by the relevant policymakers. First, on tax policy. Cannabis tax policy in the states that have chosen to reform their laws for adult use has had mixed results. Some states work hard to design taxation systems that they see as effective, while others have taken what I call a dartboard approach. They pick a random number for excise and/or sales taxes, and they proceed with that. Obviously, I would strongly advise the work group against the latter. And while that may be apparent to each of you, it has not been so clear to your colleagues in other states. Cannabis tax policy is about more than just a round number. States want cannabis tax and fee revenue to fund regulatory systems, the regulatory system itself, so that traditional state appropriations will not be needed. States typically want funding for what they consider potential post-legalization externalities, such as increases in the demand for mental health and addiction services, police retraining, driver education regarding DUID, funding for youth prevention programs in schools, et cetera. In addition, I know from prior workgroup hearings on this issue that in Maryland, like in other states, there's a desire to use some portion of cannabis tax revenue to advance social equity and criminal justice reform efforts, and I applaud those significantly. So there are obviously multiple uses for cannabis tax and fee revenue, and of course, there will not be enough to fund every program that everyone in the legislature wants. Nor, it's important to note, will the legalization of cannabis solve all of a state's budget woes. And to that end, setting public expectations around what cannabis revenue can do and what it cannot do is absolutely essential and really important for the legislature to take the lead on that. However, while there are multiple reasons that motivate states to institute high taxes or to layer taxes around cannabis, there are also reasons to keep taxes low. One that stands out is an effort to displace or eliminate the black market for cannabis. If tax rates are too high, the price of cannabis will be significantly higher in the legal market than it is in the black market, and consumers will behave accordingly. Similarly, the traditional black market is not the only option for Marylanders. Virginia has legalized cannabis and has dispensaries open in that state. Many Marylanders will be able to take a short drive to buy cannabis just across the border. The same is true with New Jersey, not too far away, and the gifting market in the District of Columbia. There's also bipartisan support in Pennsylvania for legalizing adult use cannabis. And if the Commonwealth chooses to do that, the vast majority of Marylanders would not need to travel far to purchase legal cannabis in that state. Thus, as Maryland considers tax policy, it must also consider tax policies of neighboring or nearby states who provide Marylanders with alternative options to their own domestic market. And so once again, these are all competing choices. You can't fund all of the public programs you want with cannabis tax revenue while simultaneously keeping prices and taxes low enough to displace the black market in significant ways or to convince Marylanders to purchase at home. Next, I'll move on to cannabis regulation broadly. Cannabis regulation is the backbone of any system. It dictates the rules of the game, helps determine winners and losers, significantly affects the price of cannabis to the consumer, and plays a critical role in having policy match public expectations. Members of the legislature, as well as your constituents who support cannabis reform, want a few basic items to be true of a regulated system. They want a safe, consistent supply with appropriate checks for adulterants, potency, mold, and unsafe additives. They want that product to be reasonably available to adults who choose to purchase and consume it, and for the price of that product to be reasonable. They do not want the adult use system to impact Maryland's medical cannabis system in ways that keep the state's most vulnerable residents from having access to their medicine. They want identification checks at dispensaries for age, as well as consumer education about use, abuse, and safety. They also want a closed-loop supply chain in which product isn't falling off the back of trucks and being diverted to gray or black markets. These are reasonable asks from the public, and they are reasonable asks from each of you. The regulatory choices the legislature makes, and just as important, the authority that the legislature delegates to regulatory agencies, will determine the ability of the state to meet those public expectations. That determination will affect whether Maryland residents see cannabis reform as a successful endeavor or whether they see it as something that they regret. In addition, as with tax policy, choices over regulations come with costs and benefits. As legislators and later for regulators, it's critical to ask whether each regulatory decision is vital, whether it's an efficient means to achieve the desired policy end, and whether it contradicts or complicates other regulatory choices. Each layer of regulation produces a cost that's ultimately passed on to the consumer. Now, I don't intend to signal that regulations are a net negative or overly costly. It's important to be clear, regulations are important, and that a lack of regulations also incur social costs, increased drug driving, unsafe products, mislabeled items, increased youth use, etc. Instead, thinking about building as many efficiencies into the regulatory system as possible should be the primary goal of the work of this work group and later of legislators who are promulgating rules. Related to such efficiencies, policymakers must also avoid unnecessary regulatory complexity. A regulatory landscape that makes it difficult for business owners and consumers to operate within the market generates direct and indirect costs. The direct costs are obvious. Additional staff must be hired, staff must work longer hours, and each of those costs money, effectively generating an additional tax on the consumer through increased prices. At the same time, regulatory complexity is easier to navigate and digest for larger, better funded, better staffed companies with significant experience. Smaller, less well-funded, less experienced business owners may struggle to operate and succeed in that complex regulatory environment. And we know the businesses that will face such struggles will be disproportionately women-owned, disproportionately minority-owned, and/or be run by new entrepreneurs, or some combination of those three. Ultimately, regulatory policy is social equity policy, and the choices you make in designing a regulatory system directly impacts how equitable your system will be in operation. To achieve greater balance, greater parity, greater equity, the legislature should lead from the start and ultimately charge a potential regulatory agency to foster an environment of cooperation, patience, and education, especially for new business owners, small business owners, and business owners from non-traditional backgrounds. Next, I'll talk a bit about licensing policy. Cannabis operator licensing can be among the most controversial and contentious aspects of reform policy. Most states ultimately end up in litigation with prospective companies who applied for licenses and were denied. Licensing also sits at the core of states' social equity programming, an effort to draw more diverse ownership into the cannabis space. Thus far, states' efforts in the latter area have been mixed in terms of success. Challenges around designing licensing policy are numerous, and in these remarks, I'll touch on a few of them, but not all of them. The core problem centers on who receives a license and how that process of selecting licenses is designed and executed. Some states have had very open and public deliberative processes with clear statements of criteria and scoring procedures. Other states have been closed and been subject to allegations of unfair treatment and corruption. Still, other states have operated on a continuum in between those two extremes. Transparency at every stage of the licensing process is absolutely essential. Those charged with designing criteria, scoring applications, and making final determinations should not have any vested interest in a cannabis company or a related company, and they should have judgment and a commitment to fairness that's beyond reproach. As Maryland learned the hard way in its initial round of licensing in the medical cannabis program, early mistakes are difficult to overcome. A first round of licensing provides companies with a first mover advantage that subsequently disadvantages other companies that apply for licenses later. Taking time and approaching the process with care and diligence will save the state headaches later on, including potentially costly litigation. In addition, the costs of licensure have direct effects on who can enter the industry. License application costs and licensure fees that are too high will box out most potential applicants. We've seen this in states that have high barriers to entry. In those states, the cannabis industry is dominated by owners who are disproportionately white, disproportionately male, and typically already wealthy from another business. Such a situation can also create biases in favor of multi-state operators. We've also seen that in states with application costs and licensure fees that are too low, the market will be flooded with operators who produce cannabis in too high of quantities, vastly outstripping demand and driving down the cost of cannabis to a level that's unsustainable for a business. Too often, licensing policy designers ignore non-process elements, such as fee levels, that have just as big of an impact on the industry. And we know when industries begin to teeter, when they're having problems, that the types of business owners who suffer the most are first-time business owners, women business owners, and business owners of color. Another area in which licensure policy can become so complicated that it harms business owners and their ability to get up and running involves intergovernmental relations. When licensing policy is spread across state, county, and/or municipal governments, it takes significant coordination to ensure that each different regulatory system is harmonized and can work together. We have examples from states where that type of cooperation was lacking, and it caused significant delays or other regulatory challenges for business owners trying to get up and running. The final area I'll discuss as a potential landmine in the cannabis licensing space involves initially relying on the existing medical market to support the adult use market. This is a process very commonly used in the states, but as I've noted above, such policy choices come with costs and benefits. Relying on the existing medical market allows regulators greater familiarity with those operating in the industry. And especially early on, that type of familiarity can be beneficial for enforcement. Similarly, relying on the existing medical market can and surely will increase the speed by which the adult use market can be stood up and functional, delivering product to dispensary shelves faster. At the same time, reliance on the existing medical market comes with potential challenges or drawbacks. It can stymie social equity and industry diversity efforts, especially when the existing medical market lacks a level of social equity ownership and diversity that the state would like to see. It also provides that first mover advantage I spoke about above, making it more difficult for those who enter the adult use space later to be as successful as the well-established firms. Finally, in some states, aggressive steps needed to be taken in order to protect the supply chain for medical patients. As operators preferred to sell products to the adult use market at higher prices than the medical market, raised prices on medical patients because demand was dramatically outpacing supply early on, or faced the real risk of medical cannabis product shortages, states needed to act, sometimes retrospectively, rarely prospectively. Ultimately, these licensing decisions are complex balances of competing needs, just like choices over taxation and regulation. I hope my comments tonight have helped illuminate the need for careful, thoughtful planning that examines competing interests and outcomes. I also hope the work group will take to heart my warning at the start of this session that those who may promise that you can achieve all your goals efficiently are not providing a full accounting of the realities of regulating adult use cannabis in the United States. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Dr. Hudak from the work group? If you have a question, please use the raise your hand function. And while people figure that out, well, we'll go right now. We'll go first to Delegate Lutke. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Hudak, for your presentation. So I want to focus for a second on some questions related to taxation. And let me start, first of all, one of the discussions that we tentatively began to have last year was whether to look at taxing fully at point of sale or doing some combination where we have an excise tax applied earlier in the supply chain. Do you have any evidence that either of those options is better or worse than the other, or are they essentially equivalent?
There are some issues that pop up, particularly in the early stages of legalization. That is, as product first starts to get on shelves. Typically, because product shortages exist, whether it is because there are not a lot of operators up and running, those operators are not growing yet at full capacity, the supply of cannabis to the market is low, and thus the price is quite high. So when you're taxing at the price point, what you end up doing is essentially double harming the consumer and double harming the goals that you seek to achieve. You not only have high prices, which are going to disincentivize consumers from coming to the legal market, but then in addition to the higher prices, you're taxing at the price point. If you do a percentage-based model, you're taxing at the price point an inflated price. So you're jacking up that price even more through taxation. And so what we've seen in states is if you're working in that way, early on, you are really creating disincentives to transition people from the illicit market over to the legal market. Now, there are some variations on how to tax that I think have some real merit. One of the ways that states like Alaska and California have sought to look at the excise taxes is to tax by weight and not by price point. So there's a little bit more stability in the impact of taxes on the final price point, because again, you're taxing at weight and not simply based on a variable price over time. Other states like New Jersey have a sliding scale for taxes. So depending on what the unit rate of price is, the taxes adjust accordingly. So if the price is very high, the tax rate will decrease. If the price of cannabis is quite low, the tax rate will increase. So there's some stability. You're muting a little bit of the variability in that tax system. And then finally, one of the newer ways that some people have been advocating, and I think there is some merit to it, that New York is going to start to adopt, is taxing by potency. And that's certainly a policy choice that this legislature would have, to say that if you're going to have dab products, which are very high potency products, you're going to tax those at much higher rates than you're going to tax lower potency products, say edibles or low THC cannabis flower relative to higher THC cannabis flower. All that is to say that there are a lot of choices that are out there. But at the end of the day, the choice you need to factor in is the decision you really need to factor in is put yourself in the shoes of the average cannabis consumer in Maryland. How are you going to react to certain price levels, to certain tax levels? Is it going to keep you in the black market, or is it going to allow you the economic freedom to transition into the legal market? And I think thinking about taxing by weight, particularly for an excise tax, having the type of sliding scales based on price, or taxing by potency, will do what some of the early states like Colorado and Washington, Nevada, and other states made the mistake of doing, which was essentially throwing caution to the wind, letting tax rates fall however they fall, even with inflated price points for cannabis.
Mr. Chairman, if I can follow up. So in the New Jersey example, so the tax rates are low when prices are high, they're high when prices are low. Presumably their experience, like most of the other states, will be that prices tend to start high and then kind of level out a little bit over time. So the rates will go up over time. Are they then, is their tax rate based on price beyond that? I mean, is it a percentage that increases or decreases, or is it a per volume or per weight tax?
Yeah, it's price based, and so, like I said, it tries to create that type of stability in the ultimate price point to the consumer. But that's their goal. Yes.
Okay, and then with the THC based taxes, I'd heard concerns when that idea was first being proposed about challenges with the measurement and consistency of measurement of the THC levels in product, and even the consistency within the same product, particularly if it's bud or flower or something like that. How is New York dealing with that testing consistency issue?
So I think the jury is still out because New York's legalization system is so new. What I will say is one way that I have seen in the research around this that I think if states that are looking to tax by potency would be well served to do is essentially to create ranges. And so what we know, and to your question, Delegate, is that there's variation even within the same product. Cannabis is an agricultural commodity. There's variations that exist, particularly around THC. And so instead of having a sliding scale that essentially goes by the 1/10 of a percent of THC, you could have ranges of something like under 15%, under 30%, and so on, so that you're not impacting a business in such a minutia way that from one harvest to another, they have really no idea what their products are going to be taxed at. And that's a more effective way, again, to create that kind of stability. You want stability for the consumer on the price point. You also want some stability for business planning purposes. If if a business knows, if a grower knows that if they start to get up above 30% THC, that those products just don't sell anymore, you want them to have that type of stability of knowledge so that they can adjust accordingly to what their future harvests are going to be. And you're not putting those businesses at a real disadvantage. That's something that in particular will help a small business that will be less capable of absorbing those types of cycles or market shocks that could exist.
But then that would, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I didn't expect to have a follow-up, but now I do. But then that would create...
You're in judiciary world. You just keep going. It's fine.
We're not allowed to ask this many questions in Ways and Means. So.
Well, Vanessa didn't remember, I guess, but that's fine. Go ahead.
But then that would create its own market impacts, right? Because you'd have particularly, companies that are making edibles and things like that, they would be targeting their products. If the taxation cliff was at, say, 30%, they'd be targeting all their products at 29%. I mean, it would have its own impacts, and you would have those cliffs where you'd see sudden jumps in taxation for relatively small marginal increases in THC levels.
Absolutely. Depending on the design, you would definitely, you'll have market effects regardless. You could have those types of cliff effects if you do have those sort of hard limits put into place. One of the other goals of that type of potency-based tax policy is to try to disincentivize higher potency products and to drive consumers to lower potency products. I think that's a sort of separate conversation to be had, but if you're talking about market effects, if one of your goals is to disincentivize higher THC products, those cliffs could be the market effects that you want. I'm not saying that I'm proposing that or endorsing that, but those types of cliff effects could be desirable if you're using tax policy to influence demand.
Mr. Chairman, for future conversation, might be worth us talking a little bit to the folks that do the taxation on distilled spirits, because there's a similar challenge there, and the way the state does it is to have a marginally increasing excise tax on distilled spirits depending on the alcohol content of the spirits as a way to discourage those higher potency spirits. But appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Hudak.
Thank you.
I will say that one of the things I hope to start to put together, then I'll encourage members of the work group to begin to reach out to me generally, but also to Delegate Ludke on issues related to taxation and Chair Wilson related to the licensing structure. If there are specific issues you'd like us to look at going forward, we're going to start putting together those presentations for after July 19th here shortly. So I'll encourage members to take a look at that and to reach out to them. I have a couple questions. You talked about the challenge with the tax rate and being near other states, bordering states that also have legalized marijuana. I don't necessarily mean to put you on the spot, but three of them that are, well, really four, but three that are pretty close together are Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. I mean, do they have starkly different taxation methods or structures, I would assume it's too early to really learn from what they from whether that process has worked as they've expected or not. But I'm wondering how the three will kind of compete with each other. I wonder if that's a good microcosm at least to look at.
No, I think it's a really good question. And now it's broadening even more, right? Rhode Island legalized 2 weeks ago. Massachusetts has been legal since 2016. So you're starting to get this core of New England and then the tri-state area coming forward with what is going to be variable tax policy with profound ease of movement from state to state. As I mentioned, New Jersey with the sliding scale based on price, New York taxing on potency. Those are some more experimental approaches to cannabis tax policy. And so I think you're right, Mr. Chairman. The jury is out. We're going to start to see what types of incentive structures are generated by variable tax policies across the states. We do have some evidence to learn from previous iterations, and that was Washington and Oregon. Washington legalizes in 2012, Oregon legalizes in 2014. Washington had profoundly high tax levels. You tax 25% at the producer level, 25% at the processor level, and then 25% at the dispensary level. You can imagine what that did to the price of cannabis, particularly early on in Washington. Oregon comes online, and they have a much lower tax rate, around 30%. What does Washington do? They realize that there are a lot of people who live in Southern Washington who live really close to Portland, and they could drive very easily across the border and buy cannabis for much cheaper. Washington passed tax reform, cannabis tax reform in that state. They didn't bring that level down entirely to the exact level of Oregon, but they brought it down pretty close. And it shows that market response. Some of it was prospective on behalf of Washington, just looking at the sheer numbers, but there was a retrospective aspect to it, and they didn't move right away. And so there is going to be this growing effort in states now that we have a lot of states that border each other: California and Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and of course the Northeast core, where this is going to be a game. We see this type of game in tax policy. For instance, I know there's a lot of Marylanders who drive across the border into Virginia to buy tobacco products. Those types of things are real forces. I mean, I live in the District of Columbia, and I thank you guys for your work, because I drive 2 miles up the street and buy gas in Tacoma Park, Maryland, because it's a hell of a lot cheaper than it is in the gas stations in my neighborhood. And so these types of cross-border movements based on tax policy and price points is alive and well in a lot of industries in the United States, particularly in geographically smaller states, and it will certainly impact the choices of consumers in Maryland as well.
Okay, I'll go to Chair Wilson for a question, and if anyone else has questions as well, happy to hear from you. But Chair Wilson, please.
Thank you, Doctor. My question revolves again around the taxes that you've been discussing. What I would like to know and get some background on is the actual cost of the implementation of these statewide cannabis programs, because I don't believe that this should be a windfall for the state of Maryland at all. I think the goal of the legislature, if indeed this passes, was to take this out of the criminal market. And obviously, as you spoke, anytime we artificially inflate the cost, it will indeed, as California and Washington and other states have dealt with, you create and empower that criminal market. So I would like to hear more about the cost of implementation of the program. And I know that that's a big ask. So obviously I can't ask you to do that now, because I do believe that that's how we should base our tax structure and work backwards. This should be more about oversight and accountability. And I am a big fan of that, especially when it comes to the implementation, ensuring stuff doesn't fall off the truck, seed to sale. But again, avoiding this overtaxing, it should start with the basis of how much this is going to cost our state to implement and safely have the oversight that we need, not how much money we can make off of the program. As such, in further conversations, it would be interesting to see what the states spend, on the legalized cannabis program, so we could determine how much money we would need. And I would argue then work backwards to get to that goal, instead of setting a somewhat random guessing price point. Because again, I don't believe that this should be something we shouldn't be using this money to fund anything except overseeing, regulating, and make sure we have a strong, robust program for the state of Maryland. So I would ask again at some future point to start to see what the other states' cost of this is. Thank you.
Chair Wilson, that's a great question, and it's actually a perfect discussion of how tax policy in the United States, tax policy in a state should be designed. As I said before, you don't throw a dart at a dartboard and find a number. That type of reverse engineering is the way to go. And so you think about all of the things that you want to achieve or don't want to achieve, the type of black market displacement. To be honest, one of the things that I never hear states really talking about when they're designing policies around taxes, around the number of licenses, the amount of canopy space to do, is to look at the price of illicit cannabis. That's where you start, right? In order for you to displace the black market with a legal system, you should know what people are buying it off the street for. And if you don't know that, you don't know anything. And so I like your point about reverse engineering this. I will say, in terms of the cost of implementation of cannabis, there are a lot of upfront costs. And so in the first couple of years, there's going to have to be general appropriations set for this because you're not going to be getting in that tax or fee revenue right off the bat. You're going to have to hire enforcement officers. It depends significantly on how many companies are operating, how much canopy space that you have. Now, having a state that is relatively geographically small like Maryland obviously does help. You can imagine it's a heck of a lot harder to hire and fund an enforcement division for a state the size of California, not just population-wise, but geographically, or take a state like Colorado, which population-wise is very close to the size of Maryland, but geographically a behemoth by comparison. Those things all factor in. And so understanding what you need in terms of the enforcement division of cannabis regulation, understanding how those needs might change over time, particularly as the market grows, and then figuring out how you want to use other funds. And I know from previous work group hearings, having funding set aside for particularly women and minority-owned businesses, having money set aside to help with some of the criminal justice and other social equity programming is important. But one of the things that I have seen in other states happen, which I really frown upon, is for legislators from a bunch of different committees, a bunch of different ideological backgrounds, a bunch of different issue area pioneers, just wanting to get to the trough to take some of that cannabis money for their pet projects. And that's a very quick way, as you noted, Chair Wilson, of just inflating the price of cannabis, empowering the black market, really hurting consumers who want to do the right thing and purchase from the legal market. And so looking around at states that have taken that step to legalize before you, that have similar sized populations, they're similarly sized geographically. Massachusetts is an ideal example, geographically very similar in size, population-wise very similar in size. Looking at the types of costs that they have incurred, that's the best way to understand what Maryland is going to incur. And then thinking about how to design tax policy from that point, I think is a great step in the right direction.
And I just wanted to add briefly that I appreciate that because I do understand about the upfront costs, and I think it's also important to realize that there are some costs we may never get back. Again, if our goal is to keep this affordable, then as a state, if this is what we're going to invest in, and we're investing again in the decriminalization and keeping this out of the hands of the black market, then there may be some upfront costs that we do indeed have to swallow that we are not going to make back from our taxing of the marijuana. But I do look forward to communicating with you. I think I've been following along with California and Colorado and Washington and their disastrous implementation. Oklahoma's, I think, following on the same path we are currently. And I watched them do a very, very good job in the medical marijuana side, unlike Maryland. And so I'm also going to be very interested in seeing how Oklahoma, weirdly enough, handles their, I do believe that it's on the ballot for them as well. But again, I would be interested in hearing some feedback on the cost of the other states. Thank you.
I have a few more questions now. And we'll hear from Delegate Barnes and Delegate Moon and Chair Pena-Melnick. Delegate Barnes, please.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hudak. I just wanted to go back to Chairman Wilson's point of the reverse engineering and looking at here in the state of Maryland and really looking at what we did in medical cannabis to ensure that we get it right with legalizing marijuana here in the state of Maryland. And coming up with a number as far as applications or those that would be able to sell marijuana and produce marijuana here in the state. Is there a recommended number that we start at, or should there be a license cap at all as we move forward with this?
So that's a great question. License caps can be really tricky, Delegate Barnes, in terms of boxing people out of the industry. Now, to Chair Wilson's point before about Oklahoma, I'm someone who does not look to the Oklahoma model as something that should be replicated. The too low barriers of entry there are creating a massive oversupply of cannabis that eventually is going to hurt, I think, a lot of Black, Brown, and Indigenous owned businesses in that state. But I do think when you compare something like that to a state with extraordinarily high barriers to entry, you're really looking at two sides of the same coin. And it's probably a little easier to fix the Oklahoma system than it is to fix a system with the higher barriers to entry. One of the things that I always recommend to states is, in advance of legalization, do a demand study. I've written a demand study for the state of Illinois before. They're not particularly difficult to find. You could fund them. You could probably find someone within state government with the capacity to do that if you wanted to really understand, based on user levels, based on different regions of the state, and their proximity to other states. Maryland does have a unique situation relative to some other states. You have a lot of federal employees who live in the state of Maryland, particularly Southern Maryland, but in other parts of the state too that have federal facilities outside the Beltway. That's a group of individuals that are probably going to use at much significantly lower levels because of security clearances and in some cases workplace testing. So you factor in tourism, people coming to the Bay, people coming to the Eastern Shore, people coming to the coast every year, they're going to come buy cannabis. And so factoring all of that in is going to give you an idea of how much Maryland should probably produce in a year. And while, again, I'm not a huge proponent of caps on the number of licenses, there are ways to incentivize a type of equilibrium of production that's going to be important. So Maryland is not producing enough cannabis for everyone in California, but they're also not producing an amount of cannabis that is only gonna provide for Montgomery County. You want to hit that sweet spot, and a demand study is the best first step toward understanding what those levels look like and how to create policy and licensure policy in particular to achieve those ends.
Yeah, because I have also been following what other states have been doing, and they're looking at the number of licenses that we would do here in the state of Maryland. Or should we have a cap or not have a cap? What is the recommended application fee or licensing fee or that point of entry, especially when you start looking at the equity and inclusion aspect of this and trying to get more minorities to participate in this industry?
I think you want those types of application fees and licensure fees to be sufficient enough that that an individual would have enough capital to be able to run a business. So, for instance, you have some states that have really low licensure fees of $250 or something like that. Well, anyone who wants to start a business is going to have $250, right? If you have some states that have, $7,500, $100,000 licensure fees, one argument could be made, well, if you can't afford a $1,000 licensure fee, how are you ever going to run a business? I don't take that approach, but that's one approach. The way I look at it is you want to have probably, a multi-$1,000 application fee. Part of that fee helps run the enforcement agency, helps the people do the application review processes. But when you think about, let's say, a $5,000 application fee relative to a $75,000 application fee, most businesses can find a lot better uses for that difference of $70,000 when they're starting to set up a business. And that's going to be particularly true for new business owners, women business owners, and minority business owners. And so I think that's an important conversation to have internally. I don't like I said, I do not support dirt low fees like that because they just don't serve any purpose, and they also don't bring in revenue to fund the enforcement division, or tremendously high ones where really at the end of the day, you're just going to get millionaires or multi-state operators who are the only people who are going to be able to afford that. So it's that balance in policy choices that I said before that's going to be really critical to taking the steps to design the system to create equity to create fairness and to give opportunities, not just for someone, and I say this a lot in my work, the goal here should never be, let's try to find as many licenses as we can for minority-owned businesses. The point is not getting the license. The point is for licensees to succeed in industry.
Yeah.
The worst thing than not allowing a minority ownership in the cannabis industry is to allow minority ownership in the cannabis industry in a way that sets them up to fail, because people are going to put their whole life savings into that. And if they're going to lose it in 6 months, then you hurt them more than if you didn't even let them into the industry in the first place. And so thinking about not just licensure approval, but industry success and company success has to be a part of the system for fairness to be true.
No, and I totally agree. And I hope we have learned that lesson from medical cannabis when we rolled it out here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate. Let's go to the Vice Chair of Judiciary, Delegate Moon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue on this thread that Chair Wilson started about not making revenue generation the prime goal of a legalization system. And I'd be curious to hear more about what we would do if one of our key goals was reducing the appeal of the black market. And what I would point out here is it seems like a lot of this conversation has been focused on cost and the impact of taxes and regulation on the cost. And there's clearly a theory here that the cost drives behavior in and out of the black market. And while that seems obvious and true, I would point out that when I think about our existing medical system and whether it may or may not have any impact on the black market, I think of two things. One is the barrier to entry, a couple $100 plus a doctor visit and a card and all this stuff, and then you finally can go somewhere. But putting that aside, which this will solve, the other aspect is we have in like per legislative district, I think it's two dispensary licenses, something like that. So maybe in a rural county, you'll get one. And I have to wonder, again, back to this lurking question about what's the right number of licenses, and isn't it got to be related to the population density and simple convenience, in addition to, if I'm in Garrett County at Deep Creek Lake, it might be great if there's two retail dispensaries somewhere in the county, but it might be, the corner person or the person on my block might be a heck of a lot easier. And so I would think our existing license system is very suspect if we have any desire to impact the black market. And so I guess surely someone has studied this and there's a science behind this, because if weed is as ubiquitous as alcohol or tobacco and easy to get at any 7-Eleven or something, there's no reason to go to the black market. But it seems like that's not what we're talking about doing. And so I'd like to bridge this psychic disconnect I'm having about that.
It's a great point and a great question, and one that I write about semi-regularly. And geographic access is so central to a lot of efforts to displace the black market. And so the idea that getting rid of the idea of a county or a municipality or some other jurisdictional unit opting out of cannabis wishes away that cannabis exists. There's this idea that you're going to legalize cannabis and then suddenly cannabis is going to show up in your town. Like, cannabis is there already and a lot of people are using it. And so the idea that you're going to wish this away is foolish. And in fact, there's really good research from the Legal Academy that shows that entities, so jurisdictions that opt out of cannabis, still incur all of the social costs of cannabis use. They just don't get any of the tax revenue directed back to those communities to help deal with some of those things like youth use, although youth use tends not to increase with recreational legalization, but concerns over driving under the influence of drugs, concerns about mental health and addiction, et cetera. Like those are important points. And so if you make cannabis very difficult for someone to access within their domestic market, they're either going to find it in the existing black market, which is in every county in Maryland already, Or, as I said earlier, they'll drive to a place that's a little easier to get to. Now, if you're out in Western Maryland, you don't have those same options because you're not really surrounded by legal states. I mean, I guess you could get to the stretches of sort of Shenandoah, Virginia in the north, but you're just going to stick with the black market. The other challenge is and this is a real one, and it's a sort of delicate conversation to have, but it's one that's important to note. If all of your dispensaries are in Baltimore and PG County, there are going to be a lot of white Marylanders who are not going to go to those dispensaries. They want something closer to home. They want something in a place that they, quote unquote, feel safe. And so those types of, like I said, difficult to have conversations about consumer choice are real ones to have. Having cannabis dispensaries spread out across Maryland is something that is good for Maryland. Even if counties think that opting out is the way to go, it's not. And you're not going to deal with the black market if someone has to drive 100 miles to a dispensary, because you're going to empower that black market. When you look at a map of Colorado, the places where they've opted in and the places where they've opted out, you could be hundreds of miles from the nearest dispensary. And the counties, the sets of counties that are doing that, creating these sort of dry zones around it, are still having a thriving black market in that state. What they're not allowing is for their customers, their consumer base, to have tested, consistent product with labels where they know exactly what they're putting in their body. And so, Vice Chair Moon, to your point, it is critical to think about access as much as it is to think about price, because we also know when you have to drive a long distance to get a product that you want, whether it's gasoline, whether it's groceries, whatever it is, there's going to be a premium on that price, simply because there is a desert for that product there. And so the price of cannabis can vary pretty dramatically throughout a state, and those prices are extraordinarily elevated when you're the only game in town or you're the only game for a few counties around.
I will go to the chair of HGO, Chair Pena-Melnick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening. Thank you so much for your information. I have a couple of questions, if I may, and some of them are relevant to some of my colleagues. So I know that 19 states, I believe, to date in the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis use, right, recreational. So my question to you is, out of all the states that have done that, which ones have prioritized public health in their framework? That's one of them. The second one that I like to ask you is, out of all those states in the District of Columbia, what is the best sort of model that regarding taxation and regulations? Because I've seen you answer a lot. I don't like this, I don't like that, I would put this. So if you have to design a bill for us, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but if you could send it to us, if I may ask the chair, like a checklist of what should be in there regarding the taxation, the regulations, the public health, and equity, because equity should be at the center of it, and public health, in my opinion, if I would, draft it at the end. So I'll leave it there and see if you can recall my comment. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So what I'll say is I can't point to one state to say that a state has really gotten everything right. So I'll give you an example. In terms of setting up a pretty tightly regulated system with seed to sale tracking, relatively reasonable tax rates, et cetera, Colorado's actually done a pretty good job, even though they were first out of the gate. There's a lot of people who will slam the Colorado model, but from the sort of bare bones of the structure of it, they did it well. They've made some adjustments to the system in terms of licensure policy, in terms of taxes in particular. The difficulties outside of the urban areas in Colorado of actually getting counties to opt in is difficult, but that's not really a choice of the state. That's an individual choice of the county. But, in the same breath, one of the biggest weaknesses in the Colorado model is out of the gate, they didn't do anything about equity. It is not built into their system. And now they're going back now after almost 10 years and trying to get equity into that system. And it's just too late. I mean, you're not going to set up a system that's going to be effective. You have a state like Illinois and states like Illinois and Massachusetts, which have Illinois has had its own problems in terms of licensing and in getting the industry stood up in a significant way. But one of the nice things that Illinois did, and Massachusetts did it too, is they took their first sweep at implementing their equity program, and they realized it wasn't achieving what they wanted it to achieve. Well, instead of going back and trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, they went in and they changed things. They hit the reset button in both states in terms of how they dealt with issues of equity and trying to both equity in terms of social equity provisions, getting more minority-owned businesses in the state, and also the criminal justice provisions in both of those places. And so, I think if you look to those states, you see some really exciting things there. I can obviously point to other states that have had really difficult situations in place. And I know you don't want to hear that. You want to hear more of the positives. But if you look at the system in New York, you look at the system in Connecticut, you look at the system in Virginia with regard to equity, we don't know how that's going to play out. But there are provisions within those state equity programs that are really interesting and innovative and are improving on some of the failures of past states. And so I can't say those three will be successful, but if they are, I think they're going to be models of equity programs in the United States moving forward.
Will you be so kind, if I may, Mr. Chair? Will you be so kind and send us that checklist that I
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
So much. Thank you.
Okay. I see Delegate Barnes for a second bite of the apple. Delegate Barnes.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to...
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, my computer's acting up.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Well, we'll go with Delegate Barnes. Let's try that again. Delegate Barnes.
Chairman. All right. Dr. Hudak, I just wanted to go back to your conversation centered around dispensaries. Currently, we have a little over 100 dispensaries for our medical cannabis use. Would you advise adding another 100 dispensaries for legalization, or is there a combination of use with medical and legalization that other states are using?
So part of that question is going to depend on the access that the state gives the existing medical market to enter into the adult use market. And I talked about some of the trade-offs in my opening remarks about that. There are definitely benefits to grandfather those companies in. There is the risk of those companies just dominating the adult use space and once again boxing people out. And so I can't imagine a scenario in the future if Maryland legalizes in which you don't have dispensaries that are serving both communities, both the adult use community and the medical community. You may have some that stick just to medical. You'll probably have some that are just adult use. Now, having not having a demand study in front of me, I will say though, if you do back of the envelope, there should be significantly more adult use cannabis users in a state than there would be medical cannabis users in a state. And so in terms of the number of dispensaries, I think, you're probably going to want to have more adult use dispensaries total than you have medical dispensaries, or at least them serving ones that serve both communities plus. The other two is, you can have a dispensary in one place that serves a pretty small amount of people. That will be particularly true in rural Maryland. And then you can have another dispensary that serves a significant portion of people, and that would be in more densely populated and urban areas. And so the count of dispensaries is not necessarily the best measure of whether you're meeting demand. I do think, as Vice Chair Moon mentioned in his comments and questions, thinking about population density and thinking about how to serve the public in those areas, population density is a really good way to think about it. And you might need you might need fewer dispensaries in a well-populated area, but maybe more dispensaries in more smaller towns in Western Maryland to achieve to overcome those access problems in ways that you just frankly don't need in a more heavily densely populated area. But that said, to strip all of that detail away, if you have 100 medical dispensaries in Maryland, it's hard to imagine that 100 adult use dispensaries would meet the demand of cannabis in that state.
Got it. Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Dr. Hudak? Don't want to keep us here very much longer, but I don't believe I see. Well, I have one last one, and it's not necessarily in the area of licensing or in taxation. So, but it's an issue that has come up and been brought up to me a couple times in different contexts, and it has to do with workplace testing for marijuana. We haven't really talked about it a whole lot. We talked about it a little bit, and this is definitely something that goes through Chair Wilson's committee, and I see him ripping out the remainder of his hair and shaking his head right now. But have other states sought to address issues with regard to workplace testing? And I guess there's sort of two sides to this. There's workplace testing that's done in private businesses, and then workplace testing done by public agencies, like for firefighters or for other people. So as they've gone to legalization of adult use in particular, have any other states looked at some of those issues that related to that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I'll provide an answer to it. The other that I can note, I have a paper coming out probably in the next month or two on exactly this issue. And once it's public, I'm happy to send it along to the committee to have a read. But to your question, yes, there have been some states that have revisited their workplace testing rules in states. Now, the default typically is that a state that passes adult use cannabis says businesses can determine whether they want to have a drug-free workplace. They can determine what substances are part of that drug-free workplace. The state is not going to step in and affect that. That is the vast majority of states that have done this. Other states have taken steps to do away with that. Nevada is an example of a state that has done away with the ability to test workers for no reason, fire for no cause, if you can't show impairment, things like that. It's a very complicated issue with cannabis because cannabis stays in your system for a significant part of time. It can be found in urine tests for up to a month. It can be found in hair samples for 3 to 4 months. In the same way that if on a Friday evening, I have a glass of wine, that's going to be out of my system by the time I'm at work on Monday. In the same way that if I took an edible on a Friday evening, that would be out of my system in terms of impairment by Monday. But there will still be residuals in my system for an extended period of time. And so where the conversation is starting to shift is less about whether you're testing positive and more about whether you can demonstrate impairment. In some states and some courts, state courts and now federal courts have gotten into protecting individuals in a variety of places against undue termination when they haven't demonstrated impairment. Some states have taken that step. Some municipalities have taken that step. In some cases, even without legalization going through. The city of Philadelphia, for instance, is an example. The District of Columbia has taken steps not to test certain employees who are considered exempt. We can center around the idea that, if you're a surgeon, you probably shouldn't be using certain substances if you're a firefighter or an ambulance driver. But if you're working an office job, it's probably not going to affect you that significantly. So you would not be the first state to take aggressive steps towards reforming the way that states conduct workplace testing, you will face a ton of pushback from a lot of small business industries, chambers of commerce, et cetera, who want those businesses to continue to be able to have the freedom to do what they want. At the end of the day, there is absolutely a racial justice element to this. We know in research looking at hiring managers, that hiring managers, both white and non-white hiring managers, will say that a Black employee is much less likely to pass a drug test than a white employee. These types of biases are institutionalized into HR systems in this country, and Maryland would be no different from that. And so thinking about ways that you could introduce equity while still protecting the workplace, protecting employees, and protecting the public that a workplace would interact with is key. But you can look to states like Nevada and some of the cases coming out of court cases coming out of Connecticut and New Hampshire and elsewhere to see what states are doing differently and how the core of the conversation is really shifting toward impairment and not just having residual cannabinoids or cannabinoid metabolites in your system.
All right, thank you very, very much. I appreciate you talking with us today, and thank you for joining us. If work group members have further questions for Dr. Hudak, you can email Dylan in my office at dylan.goldberg, GOLDBERG @mils.state.md.us, and he will connect the two of you. This is again the first meeting of the House Cannabis Legalization Work Group. We will meet again after July 19th, and we will be setting out a schedule for those meetings here probably in the next couple of weeks as we confer with members of the work group and figure out the most efficient way for us to do this after the primary. So I'd ask members of the work group to please keep an eye out for emails from Dylan as we seek to schedule next dates. He may be asking you if there are dates when you're going to be in or out of town so that we can try and line up next dates that work for as many people as possible. We're also going to be looking for topics. And as I mentioned before, if members of the work group have specific issues you'd like to talk about, like to learn more about related to the regulatory or licensing process, please make sure you direct those to Chair Wilson. You can send them to me too, whatever works. And if you have specific issues related to taxation, to Delegate Lutke and me, if there are issues that don't fall into those categories that you'd like us to take up, just send them to me, I guess, and then we'll go from there. All right, it's 8:15. I think that's good enough for tonight. Thank you very much. And this has been a meeting of the House Cannabis Legalization Work Group. And we will see you again very shortly. Thank you.